thank you first of all for agreeing to do this. We hope to be able to capture a lot of the lessons learned and memories over the last 20 years in creating the carbon markets. And why don't we start with focusing on the period 1997 to 2005 and what you were doing in that period, and then we can get into what your recollections are with regard to the World Bank's carbon finance business.
Well, right in the middle of the period, I was in the World Bank. I was heading the climate change team from 2000 to 2003, and therefore had not a ringside seat, but I was inside the ring. But both before and after, I was very, very closely associated with the carbon market as a first in the 1997 to 2000 phase as a potential user. What could climate markets do for us in developing countries? And in the 2004 and 2005 period, I was very actively building CDM projects which could, for example, take benefit of the markets that were created by the bank, and towards this period, end of this period, by other organizations also who were entering the field.
Yes, and if I remember correctly, the effort to work on carbon markets after your stay at the bank included work in the private sector and then subsequently at the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, this was very interesting because very clearly I moved from the bank to Suzlon with the very clear goal of building wind power in India as a source, and with using CDM as a source of financing. There was no doubt that wind energy at that point of time was more expensive than conventional energy. And CDM could take some of the cost off, that incremental cost. This was a huge opportunity, both to expand wind power as well as to set up the CDM as a market where the most cost-effective technologies come in first and get the benefit of the offsets that they provide. Now, I think it was 2006 that the CDM came into force. It was a day of great celebration, I think, for all of us in the community. And in 2006, I moved from Suzlon to the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Now, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, again, in the energy efficiency area, we have the same kinds of challenges. Because while energy efficiency makes sense in the long run, the first costs are high and are very large detriment to consumers who, for example, at that point of time wanted to buy an energy efficient CFL bulb instead of a normal incandescent bulb. And consequently, we created a CDM project in India which people could join, which would consist of geographically small CDM projects, but all using the same methodology. I forget what it was called.
BLY.
No.
Oh, the POAs.
POA, yes.
Program of Activities.
The program of activities.
Yeah.
So the CDM project for CFL bulbs was created as a program of activity. And I must say there was a huge amount of learning. It also brought a certain sense of discipline into how the dissemination of CFL bulbs occurred. And yes, it brought prices down and expanded the market for CFLs. And in the process, saved energy, saved carbon emissions.
The Bachat Lamp Yojana.
In the Bachat Lamp Yojana. That was the name of the program of activities.
Probably one of the best known POAs in the world.
But clearly there were a huge number of challenges. And working with the bank, while bank was not officially a part of the POA, but the methodology that was used was something that the bank had been associated with. How should we do the validation? Ultimately, I think I was talking to you or a colleague in the bank who said the best is think of the person who you think is going to criticize you most and use them to do the reach out to people. And so we looked around and thought it would be great if Greenpeace could do it. They, I must confess, with a certain degree of reluctance, finally agreed. I think it was the best thing because the kind of feedback we got, we would not have got it if anybody else had done the public outreach on it. And I think the project became better because of that. Now, as the project started functioning, there were all kinds of issues related to the organizations that were doing the verification. When do they do it? How do they do it? How do you choose them? What is the kind of time period? All of those kinds of things. It did not, the Bureau of Energy Efficiency is a government organization. And therefore, one of the things also was that while we, I hope, were fairly efficient in terms of time, we could have been more efficient. In fact, this is one of the things I compare between life at Suzlon and life at the Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Because selling an innovation as a business idea is much easier in the private sector than it is in the government. In the government, the first question asked is, do you really need to go this way and create all of these new structures? And convincing people that it would help in the larger scheme of things takes up a lot of time.
In terms of, we'll turn to the World Bank, but in terms of the CDM driving innovation and business models, was that the case in Suzlon as well? Because that was the period I think Suzlon was going through an explosive growth phase and wind power in general.
So Suzlon was very clearly a company that, apart from using a innovative new technology, wind technology in general, and in particular the looking at the combination of putting different size of rotors and different size of machines, matching them to meet the Indian wind energy conditions, they were absolutely the leaders. They were also the leaders in the business model, in as much as they would buy huge tracts of land, set up windmills, and then sell one windmill each to you and to me and to others, and then manage it as a whole. So it was a very different business model. But they were very interested, therefore, in seeing how this new mechanism, CDM, could help bring down the costs for their users. Now, it did not bring down the upfront cost, but what it did was it added to their income. And Suzlon was very, very aggressive about it. We sold it. Every agreement that Suzlon made to sell a wind machine had a CDM agreement built on top of it. That, I think, helped expand the market.
So turning back to the role of the bank, what is your recollection in terms of what the bank was able to achieve in terms of catalyzing the carbon market in those early years?
The bank was a market creator. More important, it convinced various governments to put in money on the basis of which projects would actually get CDM revenues. In the process, it was able to develop methodologies and, more importantly, get people to abide by those methodologies. So the first thing that it did was to be able to set up a set of guidelines, starting with boxes that could be checked off to more complete documentation. I remember that bank was the first organization which actually worked. I think it was with DNV on the verification procedure. So whether it was the contract, whether it was the verification procedure, whether it was the methodology for the project, the bank started creating the first templates. And because they had the money, they were able to get actual people, actual entrepreneurs to invest in projects which became the CDM projects. And of course, then those people got in with an adequate degree of confidence that they would be paid. This created the nucleus around which the CDM actually just grew, mushroomed into something which became much larger than any of us, I guess, had supposed at that point of time.
And in terms of the role of the bank with regard to the private sector, Do you think the bank did enough to encourage private sector in the early years, or how did it facilitate the inclusion of the private sector? They clearly, in the prototype carbon fund, there were about a dozen private sector entities there.
Right.
But beyond that,
so this is one of the interesting questions which I have been addressing time and again in my career. Yes, the great thing about the PCF was that there were a large number of private sector players who were part of the various advisory committees. But most of these people were from the developed countries. This is not to say that they were not there from the developing countries, there were. Consequently, the kind of people who we wanted to attract as entrepreneurs who would use CDM monies was not driven by the World Bank advisory committees. Now, given the structure of the bank, the bank deals with governments. The vast number of projects were government projects. But again, because methodologies were prepared, because there was a sum of money sitting there, very soon we saw private sector players from developing countries come to the bank to seek funding. Yes, they were removed one stage, but it created enough interest to get entrepreneurs to the table. Could it have been done better? When I look back, I think that with the kind of experience we have now, early in the game, especially after the first projects had been done, maybe creating specific desks in a couple of countries, just as you create special funds in countries, might have accelerated the process.
Okay. And in terms of the innovation and how it was driven, because you were a part of there, what was the dynamics inside the World Bank, you would argue, that drove the innovation? How much was it based on the institution itself, and how much was it based on the individual?
The World Bank is a huge bureaucracy, and bureaucracies do not like too much innovation. Yes, development bureaucracies like the World Bank understand that there is a need for innovation, but for bureaucracies to be able to change their own rules is difficult, and this is what happened in the case of the CDM as well. So carbon markets was like a piece that was cut out in the bank and put at one end. The fact that it ran was almost exclusively because of the personality of Ken Newcomb. So Ken Newcomb proposed, and I think at that point of time there was management in place to whom these ideas were kind of acceptable. So if limits were breached, the senior management, which was the president, the vice president, the director, would to some extent help push the boundaries out. That said, if you remember, at that point of time, most World Bank people did not either appreciate of the kind of opportunities that come about due to CDM, essentially that you get additional resources for projects that are more sustainable. But the other thing is they were actively hostile to the idea of a completely separate team doing this. Now, over a period of time, the team has evolved, the team has dispersed across the bank and has become mainstream. But believe you me, it was a time when it was fraught with tensions.
Yeah, having lived through all of it myself, I think.
You were at the center.
Yeah, but the recollection very clearly is that you were much more appreciated outside the World Bank than inside the institution.
Exactly.
And that much of the innovation was recognized primarily by those who were going to benefit from it and who were trying to understand. But in terms of the champions inside the bank, in your recollection, it's a long time ago, but did it come from some higher management? Because clearly there was the support from President Wolfenson.
Yes.
But what was the dynamics, and how do you think?
But before I come to that, I also think there is a larger issue of the fact that the bank, which has always been a public funding organization dealing with governments, now was putting out a product which would directly interact with private sector entities in developing countries. This was something that people were very uncomfortable with as well. So apart from the innovation part, this change in the target audience was also a matter of concern. Coming back to champions, clearly President Wolfenson was a champion. And because of President Wolfenson, we were able to do a lot of things which would not have happened otherwise. Now, you may disagree with me, but my belief is that President Wolfenson, Ian Johnson as Vice President and Kristalina as the Director of the Environment Program did move the envelope. Could they have done more? Yes, they could have done more. But they were not uncomfortable with the idea that a new kind of instrument was evolving within the bank. Yes, they are the people who had to fight the tension between new ways of doing business and the traditional bank way of doing business. And at many times decisions were made which in the climate finance world we thought they were stifling climate finance. But clearly, on the balance, I think they pushed climate finance.
Okay. And perhaps can I ask you to talk a little bit more on the change of business model in climate finance from upfront project finance to result-based finance that occurs because of carbon finance? Because in my own mind, that's one of the lasting contribution of the Kyoto mechanisms.
It's interesting because the World Bank also has functioned as a upfront financier.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the other challenges, apart from the fact that you're going to the private sector, one of the other challenges that the bank also faced was moving to this new concept of financing, which is based on results and which is back-loaded instead of front-loaded. If you remember, in the climate finance world, initially the model was that we would give you some of your payments as upfront money which could be invested in projects. And I think this was a 25% limit or something of that sort. I think the importance was that as people grew, as the confidence grew in the type of projects, people were more willing to accept a backloaded structure. But the backloaded structure had another problem, and the problem was the whole concept of additionality in the CDM. Because if you are willing to put up the money, you are stuck with it. And if you are stuck with it, the additionality checker will say you were invested expecting that money would come in. Yes, if you had a PPA upfront, which the bank had taken into account, the additionality was much easier. But if it was open-ended, I am going to invest at my own risk. And then as the CERs are generated, I will sell them and earn money. So that was the place where the additionality caused a problem. But you're absolutely right. What the bank did was to enable a culture in which performance and the fact that, in a sense, your payment to the banks is taken care of because of your performance. Many of us had spoken of the fact that performance should be used as a metric. We had always stumbled against the financial barrier of who would provide the upfront capital on the basis of such agreement. The only place where we had seen this was, for example, in power projects, where you had a PPA, which if you generated electricity, you would get. But what the bank was doing was providing the upfront money, and the bank was getting repaid. This was also a time when these kinds of financing moved in many large countries. China and India are great examples. It is during this time that the private sector banks, or at least the non-World Bank based financing for coal power plants also started. So there was also this general movement towards comfort in the financial institutions for payments that were based on performance and service.
Yeah, yeah. So again, looking back, what were the things that the bank could have done differently or better?
Okay, this is a very difficult question because it is almost as if it's trying to imagine, how do I create a new universe? The answer is, what could have been done? As I said, one of the things that could have been done was relatively early on, say by 2003 or so, or immediately in the years preceding the coming into force of the Kyoto Protocol, decentralize some of the operations. The second issue was that there were a lot of interested people, the cognoscenti, who were always following on what the bank was doing. But these were the converted, these were the people who were regulars at the UNFCCC Conference of Parties. One of the greatest challenges, and I realized this much more once I came to Suzlon, is explaining the concept, for example, to a person who's going to invest in wind energy. I used to take it as granted. So one of the things I think the bank could have done better was outreach. Communications. And I also believe that much of our communication was very jargon laced. And the need to make sure that it is in words that you and I can understand, I think we understand that need much better now than we did at that time.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the reaction of the private sector, in terms of the reaction of the private sector, in terms of the role of the bank, what do you recall as the view in the developing countries? I mean, certainly in the Prototype Carbon Fund, you had a dozen or so private sector investors. Correct. But in terms of private sector like Suzlon, which had probably never dealt with the bank directly, other than the IFC, what was the sense of its role and its significance?
Well, it went through phases. First of all, there was puzzlement. What on earth is the bank doing? If you've worked with IFC, we know how the IFC works. I don't know how many hoops I have to jump to work with the bank. The second, it moved into a phase where it then went into, so do I need government permissions? Then it moved into a phase of, I've met Chandrasekhar Sinha, I've gotten into an in-principle agreement with him. How do I move now? So the hand-holding was very important, and that took up a lot of time. Let me just go back and also look at one of the things that could have been done better. And I think that one of the things that clearly could have been done better was this issue of the when a private sector person is coming in, there is clarity whether they will get a carbon finance purchase agreement or not. So several people complained that they would go through a process, it would take 2 months, 3 months or whatever, and they weren't sure of what the result would be. So looking back, I think that some kind of guidance, if this is so, okay, if this is so, okay, if this is not, out. So some kind of a decision tree would have helped, because then the entrepreneur would know, if I've done this right, I've done this right, I've done this right, it means success.
Yeah, and also I think the expectations of the quality of service in terms of the timelines are so different. Yeah, so different.
That again has to do with the bank's role as traditionally as a public funder to moving to the private sector. Private sector expects that financing will be closed in 6 weeks. The bank thinks in, forget 6 months or several years by the time financing is closed. So yes, there are differences in the time frames that people look at for financing.
So if we turn to the future now, and recognizing that today we are at a very similar juncture than in 97, 98 perhaps. How do you think the bank potentially can play a role? What would be the similarities? How should it do it differently this time?
So I think there are three great advantages that the bank has now as it compared to then. In every country, the dialogue between the bank and the country is much more evolved, and there is a much greater degree of consultation, including with private sector players now than there was at that time. The second is that in most countries, both amongst the government and also in the bank, there is a much clearer recognition that bank finance is in a sense the cream on the cake. The bulk of the financing is coming from either internal or external, it's outside. The bank provides the funding which makes things go in this direction rather than this direction. This is very important. So the bank has internalized the issue of being an innovator. The third great advantage that the bank has is its huge ability now, and this had just started when we started the climate markets, in coordinating and leveraging private capital, both international private capital as well as private capital within developing countries. Let's see how this can be used. So one of the things is that we know, in a sense, each one of us, what are the sectors where there is a possible interest of both the country and the bank, and where climate finance can play a role. This is much easier to discern, and therefore you can fast track the discussions that occur between the bank, the governments, and the private sector in the developing countries and in the developed countries. This is very different. Now, I would again underline the point that this is country based. This means that as far as the bank is concerned, the amount of resources that are put in, whether it's people, and if people mean money, it is much more than if you were doing it at one place globally. It gives one more great opportunity, and that is through the leveraging with other financial institutions to see what is the base finance that is coming in that is going to be paid anyway, and therefore make a much more integrated financial structure than the base financing and incremental financing that we were talking about when we started climate finance. This means that you can go to mainstream financial institutions much faster than we were able to 20 years ago. In short, we have a much better idea of the kinds of interventions on which we can move very fast.
And the other thing is, 20 years ago, this concept was yet to be demonstrated and operationalized.
That's right.
And there was hardly any private sector experience, and it was, in every case, you had to make a fresh case.
Yes.
In the last 20 years, there have been scores of private sector institutions which have acquired experience. And from your perspective, how should the bank utilize that experience and not repeat and the concept that Ken used to use, crowd in that capacity, as opposed to what are the things that we need to do now, which the private sector cannot do?
Right. So I think one of the very important things that has happened is that there is, both at the financial institution level as well as the entrepreneur level, there's far greater experience. Now, sometimes the entrepreneur experience is negative, but the point is the capacity is there. So, as far as crowding in is concerned, I still think that it remains a very powerful tool. But the crowding in, I think we have learned, occurs in specific areas with the specific players. So if you are talking, for example, of LED bulbs, the the players you will get will be very different from the players that you will get in, say, solar rooftop. So in that much more concentrated area. The thing is that public financial institutions are already doing something or the other in these areas of interest where carbon finance interests, government interests, and World Bank interests converge. The financial institutions are looking at creating instruments. And in this market now, different financial institutions are looking at providing different kinds of financial instruments which are needed. So, for example, there are people who are creating instruments for the pension funds. Now, do pension funds, what do they need? Do they need a level of, will climate finance give them a level of confidence, or will it give them the extra percentage return that is needed? Similarly, there are people who say, okay, our goal is we will create it and then get out. Okay, is equity the best or mezzanine the best? So there will be different kinds of instruments which the private sector financial institutions today are capable of doing, which they weren't capable of doing 20 years ago.
Yeah, and in terms of the Paris Agreement and the Article 6, where you have provisions which allow government-driven regulatory framework to create the markets. What is your sense on the credibility and the convening power of the bank to facilitate that process, and distinguish here between the smaller countries in the region, say Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, versus the gorilla in the room?
I would actually argue that unless you're a country which is very, very small or has very limited capacities, the challenge always is the public sector creating the market. And let me walk through the market, for example, that we were trying to create in the Bureau of Energy Efficiency for energy service companies. So the first thing that we did was we brought BEE funded states who funded, say, building organizations to bring out projects which could be done in an ESCO mode. They didn't get any takers. So we said, okay, they said we don't know who we should go with. So we said, okay, we got CRISIL and ICRA to rate energy service companies. So both on the demand side and the supply side, you're pushing people together. Even then it didn't go anywhere because the risks that people were seeing were too high for the private sector. That's when Energy Efficiency Services Limited, ESL, was created. And as a government company, it was able to create markets where people were otherwise seeing very large risks. My central point is that market creating organizations are important, and they should be market entities. They should not be government they should not be public agencies. As in the case of ESL, it's a company which is owned by 4 government-owned companies, but it's a company. Different countries will have different kinds of structures. But I think one of the learnings that I have is whether it is the Solar Energy Corporation of India or the ESL, you need agencies that can take on the initial risks. And therefore, having governments having the confidence that this is the way to the future is very important, which was true both for the Solar Energy Corporation of India and for Energy Efficiency Services Limited.
So, but both ESL and SECI create market based on a fundamental framework
Yes.
Of regulatory systems or legislative framework that is created. Is there a role for multilateral institutions to contribute towards the creation of that framework, not necessarily the market based on that framework the way ESL and SECI has done, but initial framework itself, which in the case of ESL, BE was instrumental in creating.
So, I would suggest that at least as far as India is concerned, regulatory change occurs in order to solve a problem. It is not Well, it is seldom proactive.
Okay.
Now, how do you know there's a problem? Because you're doing something in the market. So you need somebody operating in the market and then going to the regulator and saying there's a problem. Now, once the regulator knows there's a problem, they can, I think, certainly rely on the global experience of the World Bank and or other multilateral agencies to help create the right framework which is different. By itself, I hope I am wrong, but I don't see a space for organizations like the bank to initiate regulatory change.
Okay. It's it is a challenge, right? I mean, in case where suppose you're working on something like the Paris Agreement, where neither the policies, procedure, or institutional mechanisms are clear,
Exist.
You would hope that there would be a proactive counterpart who's thinking ahead and putting in place the institutional structure. But my own observation in countries that I work on is that often happens in fewer countries that you'd like. It's typically in the area of climate change in Latin America. Institutions in South Asia and East Asia tend to be reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah, that's correct.
And there's a third set of challenge in countries like Africa, where you have to build the capacity for them to either be reactive or proactive.
I mean, I would agree with you that institutions, particularly government and regulatory institutions in this part of the world, are reactive. The strategy, therefore, has to be how do you accelerate them to work sooner rather than later. That then leads to the point that you were saying, why is it that it takes such a long time? I would argue that there is based on past Indian experience, I would think that discussions, and particularly discussions which believe that change is not important, continue to be around for a fairly long period of time. And then suddenly you have a constellation of people in various policy making positions who suddenly come across and say, this makes sense. It's based on their own learning experiences, it's based on the private sector entrepreneurs or the public sector companies that they have dealt with. So they come in with a new set of experiences. Then they want action, whether by the public companies or the private companies, and then that leads to framework changes.
Yeah.
So when it happens relatively fast. Because if you remember, for example, the CDM, India for years opposed the CDM, but suddenly they came to the point that CDM makes great sense. And then in almost no time at all, India was the largest producer of CDM projects.
And you're absolutely right in the observation that that process of buy-in was, in the case of CDM certainly, and often in other policies as well, is driven by domestic interests and companies.
That's right.
And I think the point I was getting to is that in your view, particularly as far as the World Bank is concerned, certainly there seems to be a discomfort at fully engaging in this kind of discussion because of some sensitivities with regard to whether the intention is linked or aligned with domestic intentions.
Yes, you're right. India is, to use the title of a book of a well-known Indian, India is argumentative. There are various views which are on the table at the same time. And the policymaker or regulator has to sift through those views and hammer out positions which are acceptable. Now, in doing so, the last thing that he or she wants is that there is the World Bank, which is putting something on the table, and it is giving ammunition to some of the fragmented entities on the table who say that the bank is pushing for global multinationals or globalization or whatever. The way I have found this to be most effective is that the World Bank talks to the policymakers concerned and asks, what is the kind of inputs that you want? Work on those inputs and put them in the public domain. And then the policymaker, the regulator, picks them up as she thinks fit. What this means is that it is not a formal role, but it's an informal role. The bank is not completely suited for that, but it is happening. For example, look at air pollution right now. The bank, from being on the outside of the argument, is now very much on the inside, and I'm reasonably sure that as we go ahead, it would start having, it would certainly be part of the delivery process for a cleaner air in Indian cities in the future.
Yeah, there's a term that is often used inside the bank, to provide a non-logo input to the government. So not necessarily.
I am so glad to hear that this phrase exists.
Yeah, it is. I mean, recognizing that putting your logo on it gives it a particular color, which is not necessarily
a flavor which
useful.
Yeah, exactly. Everything else is okay. Is the flavor which makes it unacceptable.
So, trying to conclude on the discussion, in terms of going forward, where should the bank staff focus on, number one? Number two, where do you think the management needs to focus on? Which is two different things, as you know. In order to be most effective in terms of catalyzing the market, because the end goal is always to catalyze the market, not necessarily to have your logo or a stamp on it, but to initiate action at a sufficient level of ambition to address the challenge of climate change.
Okay, so as far as the bank staff is concerned, I think the bank staff has certainly moved towards the acceptance of innovation in the instruments and methodologies that they deliver to partner countries. That's good. Now, what it also means is that as far as their work experience and training is concerned, the ability to work on these different structures is built in. So what I would very much like is that banks, taking in very smart PhDs is replaced by taking in people who have on the ground experience in developing innovative ideas. The country dialogues, at least the country dialogue in India and in South Asia, I've been involved in the country dialogues in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh as well. The country dialogues have become a lot more based on what the country feels is needed, with the bank providing the analytical input as to how do you prioritize them. This is an essential argument, because what it does is that it tells the bank where are the areas where you need this kind of expertise I talked about. What are the areas in which people need to be innovative? The third issue relates to management. Bank management needs to focus. Okay, I'm going to offer three things. The bank management needs to focus in their country engagement on, again, broadening the discussion. It has started happening. I would like it to be even more broadened, and the bank to put out these kinds of analytical pieces of work and put them in the public domain. The governments of the day will have politics of the moment, and therefore there will be a give and take on what countries and the bank agree should be done now. Agreed. But what is important is that the bank does not forget that there are other priority issues which are still there. They may not be on the agenda because they are not the political flavor. That's one part of the management, to ensure that the conversation in all areas continues. The second is on resource management, both money and people. So here, in the bank, you need to make sure that you deliver to the countries what they want. So that's what the vast number of people in the bank do. But there is an adequate number of people who are also at any moment of time working on things that are innovative as far as that country is concerned, even as far as climate finance is concerned. This will have to be of necessity a smaller number, but as a very clear focus for bank management to understand that some number of people, some amount of resources have to be spent on innovative ideas. The third is metrics. We talked about performance, we talked about back-ended payments. They are based on performance of the institutions. But there is also performance of the bank itself and of the bank staff. I could say with a great degree of certainty that 20 years ago, the entire performance was based on project development and the fact that a project got signed. Over a period of time, we are moving towards systems in which the performance of the project matters. But even then, because of the huge time that it takes between the time when a project is made and a project actually gets implemented, the relationship between people and what they did is often lost. But what I'm hoping is that the people who are involved in innovation are judged by a different metric as opposed to all the rest, and are therefore incentivized to focus both on innovation as well as on the implementation of those innovations.
Great.
There are many other things we could talk about, but
Yeah,
I thought in terms
exactly.
of climate finance and innovation, these were the kinds of things.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a move towards judging performance and not just having a champagne when the board approval takes place, but when your disbursement hits the benchmark.
Absolutely. When the 80% disbursement occurs, I think that's a key point.
That's the time where you should reward.
Yes.
Thanks a lot, Ajay. This was fantastic, and thanks for sharing your experiences and memories.
Absolutely great.
Thanks.